On a quiet Sunday morning in an affluent Boston suburb, Officer Mike Sullivan makes the biggest mistake of his career. Seeing a black man in casual clothes checking the windows of an expensive home, he immediately assumes criminal intent. Without warning or verification, he handcuffs and roughly detains General Marcus Richardson, one of the most decorated military leaders in U.S. history, who was simply trying to get into his own house after forgetting his keys. When the general's identity is revealed, Officer Sullivan's world is turned upside down, forcing him to confront not just his prejudices, but a shocking connection between their families that will change both men forever. Like and subscribe to follow this powerful story about how one moment of bias leads to a revelation that will shake two families to their core. Officer Mike Sullivan was having what he considered a good day. 3 traffic stops, 2 warnings issued to suspicious-looking individuals, and now this, a black man in jeans and a sweatshirt, apparently trying to break into a house in Hamilton Heights, the city's most exclusive neighborhood. "Police! Hands where I can see them!" Sullivan shouted, drawing his weapon before even getting out of his patrol car. General Marcus Richardson slowly turned from his front door, his movements deliberate and controlled. At 62, he'd faced danger in 3 wars, commanded thousands of troops, and advised presidents. Now, on his own doorstep, he was staring down the barrel of a gun. "Officer," he said calmly, "this is my home. I simply forgot my—" "On your knees, now!" Sullivan interrupted, advancing with his weapon raised. "Hands behind your head." Neighbors were emerging from their homes now. The Petersons next door, who had known Marcus for 15 years, tried to intervene. "Officer, wait! That's General Richardson." "Stay back," Sullivan ordered. "This is police business." With practiced efficiency, Sullivan cuffed the general, not noticing the surgical precision of the older man's movements, the military bearing that remained even in handcuffs. "Sir," General Richardson said quietly, as Sullivan roughly patted him down, "in my back pocket you'll find my military ID. If you just shut up, you can explain downtown why you're casing houses in this neighborhood." The general fell silent, but his eyes, which had seen the worst of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, measured the young officer carefully. He recognized something in Sullivan's stance, his aggressive certainty. "Son," he said softly, "where did you serve?" Sullivan paused in his search, thrown by the question. "What?" "Marines, I'm guessing. That's a military stance you've got. When were you in?" Sullivan's grip on the general's arm tightened. "Afghanistan, 2019, 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines. But that's none of your—" "Fox Company?" the general asked, his voice taking on a different tone. Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine. "How did you—" "Because, son, I was the one who wrote the letter to your mother when your father died, saving his entire unit in Kandahar. Captain James Sullivan was one of the finest Marines I ever commanded." The color drained from Sullivan's face as he finally really looked at the man he had in handcuffs. The proud bearing, the commanding presence, the eyes that had seen too much war. "Dear God," he whispered, You're General Richardson." "The same," the general replied quietly. "And this is my house. Though I must say, this isn't quite the welcome home I expected after spending 6 months advising at the Pentagon." Sullivan's hands shook as he fumbled with the handcuff keys. Around them, neighbors had gathered, many filming the scene on their phones. The Petersons' teenage son was already uploading the video, his face dark with anger at what he'd witnessed. "Sir, I'm so sorry, I didn't—" "Didn't what, son?" the general asked, rubbing his wrists as Sullivan removed the cuffs. "Didn't look before you judged? Didn't think a black man could own a home in this neighborhood? Or didn't remember that the man who wrote about your father's heroism was black?" Back in his patrol car, Sullivan sat with shaking hands, staring at nothing. The general's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of a letter he'd received 10 years ago, a letter that had changed his family's life. Dear Mrs. Sullivan and family, I write to you not just as James's commanding officer, but as someone who held your husband in the highest regard. His sacrifice saved 37 Marines that day. The general's voice had been just as dignified in person as it had been in that letter. Sullivan had read it so many times he'd memorized every word, but he'd never thought about the man who wrote it, never imagined. His radio crackled. "Officer Sullivan, please respond." "Sullivan here," he managed. "The chief wants you back at the station. Now." Of course he did. The video was probably viral already. Sullivan could see the headlines. "Racist cop handcuffs decorated general outside his own home." But it was worse than that. This wasn't just any general. This was the man who'd comforted his mother after his father died, who'd made sure his family received all their benefits, who'd written recommendation letters that got Sullivan into the police academy. As he drove back to the station, another memory surfaced, his mother crying as she read the letter's final paragraph. "Your husband often spoke of his son Michael, of his hopes that the boy would grow up to serve others with honor and compassion. James believed in building bridges, in seeing past differences to find our common humanity. His sacrifice embodied those values." Sullivan pulled over suddenly, unable to drive through his tears. His father had believed in building bridges, and here he was, 10 years later, destroying them with his prejudice. At the station, Chief Williams was waiting with a face like thunder. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Sir, Shut up and watch this." The chief turned his computer monitor around. The video was already on every news site. But worse than the footage of the arrest was what came after. General Richardson, speaking to reporters who'd quickly gathered outside his home. "No, I will not be pressing charges," the general was saying. "But I will say this. 10 years ago, I wrote a letter to a young man about his father's sacrifice, about his belief in building a better world. Today, that same young man put me in handcuffs because of the color of my skin. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight aren't on foreign soil, they're right here at home, in our own hearts." Sullivan felt physically ill. The chief switched off the monitor. "The general is on his way here," he said quietly. "He specifically asked to speak with you. Sir, I should resign." "Shut up, Sullivan. You're going to sit here and face what you've done. Maybe, just maybe, you'll learn something about the man you judged today, and about yourself." General Richardson arrived at the police station wearing his full dress uniform, medals and ribbons catching the fluorescent light. Officers who had been whispering about Sullivan fell silent, many standing at attention instinctively. The general moved with the same quiet dignity he'd shown while being handcuffed, but now his presence filled the entire station. Sullivan, waiting in the chief's office, felt his military training kick in, his spine straightened, his chin lifted. "At ease," the general said as he entered, though no one had formally called attention. "Officer Sullivan, would you walk with me?" It wasn't really a request. They walked in silence through the station, out into the parking lot, and to a nearby park. The general sat on a bench, gesturing for Sullivan to join him. "Tell me about your father," he said quietly. Sullivan blinked back tears. "Sir, I don't deserve..." "This isn't about what you deserve. Tell me about James. He was my hero. Everything I did, joining the Marines, becoming a cop, it was to make him proud." Sullivan's voice cracked. "But today I dishonored everything he stood for." The general pulled out an old photograph, a group of Marines in combat gear. "This was taken the day before your father died. See him there? Always smiling, even in a war zone. Know what we were talking about when this was taken?" Sullivan shook his head. You! He was showing us your picture, telling us how you'd just made the high school football team. But what I remember most was him saying, my boy's growing up in a better world than we did. That's why we're here, to make sure all our children have that chance. Tears were flowing freely down Sullivan's face now. The general continued, his voice gentle but firm. When I wrote that letter to your family, I made a promise to your father. I promised to watch over his son, to help guide you toward the man he knew you could be. I've kept track of your career, Michael. You're a good cop in many ways, brave, dedicated, skilled. But today I became everything he fought against, Sullivan whispered. No, the general corrected. Today you face the truth about yourself. The question is, what will you do with that truth? From his uniform pocket, the general pulled out another letter, the one he'd written 10 years ago. It was worn, obviously read many times. You carry this with you? Sullivan asked, recognizing it immediately. Every day. To remind me of the cost of war, of the men like your father who gave everything for what they believed in, but also to remind me that our real battle isn't always with external enemies. Sometimes it's with the prejudices and fears we carry inside us. The general stood, his medals glinting in the sunlight. I'm not going to file a complaint. Instead, I'm going to do what your father would have done, try to build a bridge. Starting tomorrow, you're being reassigned to community outreach. You'll be working with youth programs in neighborhoods you've only seen through your patrol car window. It's time you learn to see people, not stereotypes. Sullivan stood too, his back straight, despite his shame. Why are you giving me this chance, sir? Because 10 years ago I promised a dying man that I'd help his son become the person he was meant to be. Today, I'm keeping that promise. The next morning, Sullivan stood before a group of Black and Hispanic teenagers at the community center, feeling more nervous than he'd ever been in combat. The general sat quietly in the back of the room, watching. My name is Officer Sullivan, he began, his voice shaking, and I'm here to tell you about the worst mistake I ever made. He told them everything, about his prejudices, about handcuffing the general, about dishonoring his father's memory. The teens listened in silence, their faces showing a mix of anger and surprise at his honesty. Yesterday, I was the kind of cop you all fear, he admitted. The kind who sees skin color before humanity. The kind your parents warn you about. And I'm here because I need to change, and because you deserve better from those sworn to protect you. A boy in the front row raised his hand. Why should we trust anything you say? You shouldn't, Sullivan replied. Trust has to be earned. That's why I'm not here to talk. I'm here to listen, to learn, to understand what it's like to live with people like I was, judging you before knowing you. One by one, the teenagers began to share their stories. Stories of being followed in stores, of being stopped for looking suspicious, of living in constant fear of the police. Each story hit Sullivan like a physical blow, showing him the impact of the prejudices he'd carried. In the back of the room, the general watched as Sullivan absorbed these hard truths. He saw the moment the young officer's defensive walls began to crumble, saw real understanding begin to dawn in his eyes. My father died in Afghanistan, Sullivan told them, his voice thick with emotion. He died protecting his entire unit, men of all races, all backgrounds. He believed in a world where everyone deserved respect, deserved a chance. Yesterday I betrayed everything he stood for, but today I'm asking for your help to become the kind of officer he would have been proud of. A girl in the back spoke up. Officer Sullivan, my brother wants to be a cop. But my parents are terrified because they think the police will never accept a black officer. What would you tell him? Sullivan looked at the general before answering. I would tell him that some of the finest officers I know are black, that we need him, need his perspective, need his understanding, and I would tell him that if he joins the force, I'll personally stand with him against anyone who judges him by his skin color, because I finally understand how wrong that is. After the session, the general approached Sullivan. "That was a good start," he said, "but it's just the beginning." "I know, sir. I have so much to learn." "Tomorrow you'll be walking a beat in this neighborhood, on foot, not in your patrol car. You'll greet people, learn their names, understand their lives. The teenagers you met today, they'll be watching to see if your words were real or just talk." Sullivan nodded. "I won't let them down, sir. Or you, or my father." The general placed a hand on Sullivan's shoulder. "Your father once told me his greatest hope was that his son would help make the world better. Yesterday you lost your way. Today you found it again. That's what matters." 1 year later, the same park where the general had confronted Sullivan hosted a very different scene. Sullivan, no longer in his patrol uniform, but wearing dress blues, stood before a crowd of community members, teenagers from the center, and fellow officers. "Today," Chief Williams announced, "we recognize Officer Michael Sullivan for his outstanding work in community relations and for establishing our new police training program, Seeing Beyond Prejudice." The general, sitting in the front row, smiled proudly. Over the past year, he had watched Sullivan transform from a cop who judged by color to an officer who built bridges in the community. Sullivan approached the microphone, holding a familiar worn letter. "A year ago, I stood in this park as a man who had forgotten his father's values. Today, I stand here because two men, my father and General Richardson, believed in building a better world." He turned to the teenagers from the community center, many of whom now considered him a mentor. "You taught me what real policing should be, not about power or prejudice, but about protection and respect. 3 of you are entering the police academy next month. I promise to be there every step of the way, making sure you never face the kind of prejudice I once carried." The general took the podium next. "A year ago, I was handcuffed on my own doorstep. Today, I'm watching the officer who handcuffed me teach other officers about confronting their biases. Sometimes our greatest mistakes lead to our most important growth." After the ceremony, Sullivan and the general walked through the neighborhood together. Children who once would have hidden from Sullivan now called out greetings. Shop owners who used to watch him suspiciously now invited him in for coffee. "Your father would be proud," the general said as they reached his house, the same one where everything had changed a year ago. "I keep his letter with me every day," Sullivan replied, along with something else. He pulled out a small photo, the teenagers from the community center surrounding him at their graduation ceremony. "They're the future of policing," he said. "A future where every officer sees people, not stereotypes. Where bridges are built, not walls." The general nodded. "Your father believed one person could make a difference. You're proving him right." As they stood there, a patrol car drove by. The officer inside, one of the teenagers Sullivan had first met at the community center, now a rookie cop, gave them a respectful salute. "Full circle," the general smiled. "From handcuffs to healing." Sullivan watched the patrol car disappear around the corner. "I'll never forget that day, sir. Never forget how close I came to being part of the problem instead of part of the solution." "Good," the general replied. "Some memories should stay sharp, not to shame us, but to remind us of how far we've come and how far we still have to go." They shook hands. No longer just the officer and the general, but two men united in a mission to make the world a little better, a little more understanding, one changed heart at a time.